Award. Oh, and now we are being recorded, so you will be kept for posterity, Erin. And so I will hand it over to you. And we're all so thrilled to learn more about restoration. Take it
Thank you.
away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dean Baskey. It's a huge honor to receive this award. It was such an honor to just know that I was nominated for it. Our college does amazing research in so many different areas. So I feel very humbled to receive this award, and thank you so much for choosing me. Let me get my PowerPoint set here. All right, so I'm just going to jump right in. Fire is a huge part of our life in Southern California, and it will continue to be part of our experience here as fires are predicted to become more frequent and larger over time. My research focuses really on ecosystem recovery following fire. So what happens after the landscape is burned? And so today this is my talk outline. I'll be going over some of the barriers to ecosystem recovery. And then I'm going to talk about the two aspects of my research program. So one is a community assembly approach to restoration that's based on ecological theory. And then the other is the more large scale remote sensing mapping portion that's focused more on applied tools for restoration planning. So in Southern California, when we hear about national forest burning and wildlands burning, it's typically our Southern California shrublands that are contributing to fire. So the iconic shrubland communities are chaparral and coastal sage scrub, and they are dominated by perennial shrub species. And then there are lots of other herbaceous and annual plant species that make up the areas in between the shrubs. So when we hear about our national forests in Southern California, they're actually mostly national shrublands. So California shrublands are really important because of their role in fire, but they're also really unique special ecosystems. They have adaptations to lots of different types of stress, including drought tolerant adaptations. They actually do require fire, and fire stimulates seed germination and resprouting of plants following fire. So you can see in this picture here, these are some shrubs that are resprouting after a fire. And our typical fire return interval in Southern California is on anywhere between 30 to more than 150 years between fires. And so one of the barriers to ecosystem recovery now is that fires tend to happen much more frequently, more like on the order of every 5 years rather than every 50 years. And so when the fires occur too frequently, it doesn't leave enough time for shrubs to mature and reproduce and set seed again before the next fire. So we start to lose some of those species from the plant community. Another aspect that complicates ecosystem recovery following fire is the invasion of non-native grass species. And this contributes to something called the grass fire cycle. So this is a phenomenon that happens in ecosystems across the world. I started working on this in Hawaiian drylands, which are also subject to invasion by grasses. In our region, we have a lot of introduced annual grasses and other annual species that create this dynamic. So what typically happens is that an intact ecosystem will be disturbed by some type of disturbance. It could be a fire, it could be cattle grazing or some other type of disturbance. And that opens up space in the ecosystem, and non-native invasive species can then start getting into those areas. And these are species that have been introduced to California from other parts of the world, mostly other Mediterranean regions. And some of them were brought intentionally and others accidentally to our region. And so then once these native systems get invaded, those invasive species are annual species. So they grow in the winter and spring, and then they completely die in the summer during the fire season. So they create a really large buildup of very dry fuel that burns very readily. So they contribute to the spread of fires throughout Southern California. And then once a fire occurs, those invasive grasses are very good at recolonizing right after the fire. And it creates this positive feedback loop where there's a high level of invasion, which creates a lot of fuel and a lot of fires, and it really benefits the invasive species over the native species. So this is one of the major barriers to recovery in our ecosystems. And so invasive grasses contribute to fire, but they also compete with native species for resources. And this is something that we study a lot in my lab. This is just an example of some of our data from the Angeles National Forest showing the cover of invasive species on the x-axis, which is an indication of the level of invasion. And then this graph here shows that the number of native species declines as the cover of invasive species increases, and also the cover of native species declines. So there's a lot of evidence out there showing that these invasive species exclude native species just through competition for things like water and nutrients and light. Another aspect of invasion is that invasive species also degrade the habitat for lots of other species, not just plants. So our iconic wildlife species depend on native plant communities for their own population growth. So as our native systems become more degraded, it degrades habitat for hundreds to thousands of other species as well. And then finally, one of the most destructive and dangerous aspects of fire is that following fire, when it does start to rain again, there's really nothing holding the soil in place. And so there's a lot of erosion, debris flows, mud flows, and this was really apparent during or following the Thomas Fire near Santa Barbara, where there was extensive damage and lives lost. And invasive species also exacerbate this problem because they are annual species. Their roots completely die in the summer, whereas our native shrubs that are adapted to fire, their roots will still be alive under the ground even after they've burned. And they can readily resprout and use those roots to hold the soil in place. So we're very focused on how to restore native shrub species quickly after fire, especially for these ecosystem services like slope stabilization. Another barrier to ecosystem recovery in our region are just the long periods of drought that we sometimes sustain. And so those are really difficult times for plants in general, and especially for small regenerating seedlings and other vulnerable plant species. And a lot of the regions that do burn are very large, and also the terrain is extremely steep and hazardous. So even when we want to go and do active restoration, it can be really difficult to safely access these areas. And then finally, when we do restoration, it's a very labor intensive and expensive process. So we have to remove threats by making fuel breaks or removing, doing extensive invasive species removal, which can take several years sometimes. And then we need to restore the habitat and propagate and reintroduce plants and then help them get established during the first several years of their growth. So this all requires a lot of resources that are usually pretty limited after the firefighting has taken up most of the funding. So our research is really aimed at looking at this process of degrading of native ecosystems and understanding how to better use restoration to take these invaded areas and push them back towards a more native functioning system. So one of the ways we do that is with the community assembly approach to restoration. And community assembly is a broad theoretical framework in ecology that just thinks about the membership in a local community based on different filters that kind of filter out species at each level. So in this schematic, there's a regional species pool. So these are all the species that exist in a large region. And if we're looking at which species would occur in a given site, the first filter will be the dispersal filter. So this is just who can get there. Are there barriers for some species? Is the site within the dispersal distance of all the species? And so you can see that some of the species get through that filter and others are excluded that can't make it to the site. The second filter is an abiotic filter. So these would be all the abiotic conditions of a site, and they determine which species can occur there. It could be some based on things like hydrology, nutrient availability, prey availability. So these would determine which species can be members of the community. And then biotic interaction filters include things like competition, predation that might exclude species, or also mutualisms that might be necessary for some species to occur. So once the species go through all the filters, we're only left with those that can tolerate and grow and reproduce in a site. So this is a really broad framework and very general framework for thinking about communities, but it's also really useful for restoration because we can actually manipulate all these filters with restoration actions. So we can add seeds to overcome dispersal limitation. We can change the environmental conditions of the site to benefit the species that we want there and to reduce the undesirable species. And we can also manipulate biotic interactions as needed. So it's been a useful framework for asking questions in restoration. So I'm going to give you some examples of how we address these different types of filters with research in my lab. And all of these studies occur in our Voorhees Ecological Reserve on campus. It's right behind parking lot J right here. This is a little over 30 hectare reserve. It is a mixture of native species and a lot of invasive species. And it's very typical of urban nature reserves in Los Angeles in the LA region because it's small and it is surrounded by lots of different types of land use. There's also a freeway nearby. So it experiences a lot of the same stresses that are typical of our region. So the first study I want to talk about addresses the dispersal filter. And this is a study related to propagule pressure. So propagule pressure is the supply of seeds or propagules into a region. And it's based on propagule size, which is the number of seeds introduced, but also propagule number, or the number of times a species is introduced. And what we know about invasive species is that the higher the propagule pressure, the more likely a species is to invade in a new range. And we wanted to test in our lab is that could we use this same kind of framework to have native species reinvade into some of these non-native grasslands. And so can we kind of use the same principles of invasion to promote the restored species to invade? And so this experiment that I'm going to show you was designed by Sierra Lauman. She designed a very elegant experiment to test this idea of propagule pressure, where she added native annual species at different numbers of seeds. And so the lowest rate is a rate that is pretty typical of a restoration project. And then her higher rates were extremely high, up on the order of 20,000 seeds per meter squared. She also had two controls for this experiment. So one was just a control looking at what was in the resident invasive community. So all of these seeds were added into an invasive grassland. And then the other control was the middle propagule pressure, but it had the invasive species weeded from these plots. So for all these other 5 treatments, there was no weeding. She just wanted to see if she could give the native species a competitive advantage by just increasing their abundance by seed. So these are some of the results from her study. We have the treatments on the x-axis here and abundance on the y. And invasive species are shown in the darker bars. So I first want to draw your attention to the lighter bars that show native species. So as propagule pressure increased, the native abundance also increased. And these higher propagule pressures had equal abundance of native species to the control where the invasive species were removed. So this was really exciting to us that we could actually do as good of a job with restoration by just adding seed, which is much easier than weeding these plots every 2 weeks or so. Also, she found that the invasive species declined as the native propagule pressure increased. So this was also really exciting finding that by just adding a lot of native seed, we could actually effectively weed these plots and reduce the invasive abundance. So these were the results from the first year of her study. Unfortunately, by the second year, those treatment effects seemed to go away. So the invasive species were all equally abundant in all of the treatments, and the native species were all had fairly low abundance, except for the treatment where the invasive species were removed. So this was a much drier year. So we're not exactly sure if it is due to the rainfall conditions in a year, or if this is just a short-term effect of seeding that doesn't last much further. So this leads us to our next steps in exploring these ideas. In Sierra's first study, she just looked at propagule size, or the number of seeds. And we would like to follow that up now with looking also at propagule number. So how many times do these native species need to be introduced to have a self-sustaining population? So stay tuned for those results. So now I want to talk about a study looking at biotic interaction filters. So we work a lot with herbivory and granivory by small mammals, a little bit with birds too. These are some of the small mammals that we've captured in our wildlife cameras, and you can see they do enjoy eating plants. And so this is Lauren Kwan's master's research. She was really interested in looking at how these herbivores impact restoration. And there's actually been not a whole lot of study of herbivory in Southern California shrublands. So she devised an experiment where she had some planted seedlings that were caged and others that weren't. And then she also wanted to explore another biotic interaction, which is facilitation. And this is when a mature shrub or tree actually benefits the seedlings that are planted beneath it by either protecting them from environmental harshness or increasing the resource availability. So she also had facilitation treatments where she planted seedlings under live shrubs, dead shrubs, and in open exposed areas. So her overarching finding was that herbivory was by far the dominant factor in controlling the survival and the growth of the species that she planted. This is showing data for one of her species, California sagebrush. And the cage treatments are the open circles, and these are the no cage treatments. So this is growth over time, and you can see much greater growth where they were caged and not being eaten by mostly rabbits and squirrels in this study. So Lauren's main finding is during restoration, cage your sage, because herbivores had a very significant impact on survival and growth. Some plant species were more susceptible to herbivory than others. So that suggests that for restoration projects that can't exclude herbivores, they could use a plant palette of more herbivore tolerant species. She found no evidence of facilitation by the mature shrubs, and instead she found that the plants that were in full sun could grow the fastest and reach an escape size sooner than the other treatments. So they could get big enough where they could start tolerating some herbivory without dying. So our next steps here, Taylor Edwards with her master's research will be exploring how herbivores shape the qualities of plant communities based on the functional types of plants that they either prefer or avoid. So we're going to get more into kind of the details about how these animals may control the community composition of plant communities. So now I want to show you an example of an abiotic filter that we've worked on a lot, which is topography. This is Robert Fitch's master's research, and he was testing how slope steepness affected the restoration of Stipa pulchra, which is a native perennial bunch grass. And so he planted seedlings in flat slopes, moderate, and steep sloped areas. Marley Antill's research followed kind of a similar idea where she was looking at different aspects of topography and how they might affect restoration. So she separated her experiment into low suitability sites for restoration and high suitability sites. And the low suitability sites had south-facing slopes that were steeper than 30%. And the high suitability sites had north-facing aspects and were more moderately sloped. So with the results of both of these studies showed that moderate slopes had the highest soil moisture and the best plant establishment. The steep south-facing slopes were very difficult to restore, and the plants on steep slopes were constantly covered by small landslides. So there was a lot of seed burial and seedling burial on those sites. And then in Robert's experiment, the mature plants were actually covered over with a little mini landslide during one rain event. So those are really, those south-facing steep slopes are going to continue to be a challenge for restoration. We are expanding on this idea of topographic variability in restoration with Mark Majny's master's thesis. And he's working on a project in the Copper Fire, which happened in 2002. It was a really large fire near Santa Clarita. And he is looking at restoration in 30 plots that vary kind of on a topographic stress gradient with lots of different types of features. And then he's also testing some new ideas in using some forestry methods. So specifically these plastic tree tubes that are used to shelter seedlings. And he is going to be testing just the efficacy of this method, but also if this method could help ameliorate some of the stress in those south-facing steep slopes that are difficult to restore. So can we kind of make the conditions a little bit more favorable to get plants established there? So just to kind of review this part of the talk, we have a lot of different research projects happening that address various community assembly filters with the hopes that they will help inform restoration practice. So we found that seeding at high rates had short-term success in improving native establishment, but we need to do more study to see what the long-term outcomes will be. We've found a lot of evidence that topography can really control the establishment and growth of a variety of native plant species. And we found that you really should cage your sage, and herbivores are a very significant barrier to restoration. And this is something that we were not really expecting and hasn't been studied very much. So we're excited to explore this more and see what we can find. So now I want to move into the larger scale remote sensing part of my research. So this framework for looking at landscapes is really designed to help prioritize management activities in really large areas. So I started working on these ideas in Hawaii on some military installations there that were very large and had a lot of management issues to prioritize. And this framework also applies very well to our very large fires that are occurring here in Southern California, because we have these huge areas of very inaccessible terrain where we need to start making decisions on what we're going to do following those fires. So we are focused on understanding how to manage these sites by removing threats and increasing the survival of planted individuals. And the overall goal really is to use sort of a precision restoration model where we can target the management activities to portions of the landscape where they're likely to have the greatest impact or success. Because this is a large-scale endeavor, it requires large-scale data. So we use remote sensing data to do this analysis. And remote sensing is just gathering information about an object from a distance using a sensor, just like your digital camera on your phone. The digital camera records reflectance in the electromagnetic spectrum in the visible range of wavelengths. And then your computer puts those reflectances together using software to give you all the individual colors. Well, our sensors collect data in a broad range of wavelengths that allow us to also observe different types of landscape features that are important to us. So we can pull out the signatures of healthy vegetation or unhealthy vegetation, soil, and other landscape features that are important to map. The other sensor that we use is light detecting and ranging, or LiDAR. And this is an active sensor that emits laser pulses that hit the ground and bounce off the ground and come back to the sensor and are recorded. And this sensor is used to make very detailed maps of ground elevation. So from the sensor, we can get models of the ground surface, which is a digital elevation model. We can also get data on the height of vegetation as well. And this is a very data-rich way of creating these digital elevation models. So I'm going to focus on topography today and talking about this digital elevation model because topography is one of the main things that we've focused on for restoration. So this is an example here of using this kind of framework for a site undergoing management in Hawaii. This is a site on the Big Island of Hawaii between the Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa volcanoes. It is a shrubland very similar to our Southern California shrublands. It gets the same annual rainfall as Pomona. And it's very windy, and fire is an issue in this region as well. So for our purposes for this project, we define topographic suitability as sites that are in depressions that are protected from the wind by some kind of a topographic feature would be more suitable for plants because the plants there would be sheltered from wind and other stresses and have more resources available. And then the low suitability areas would be these ridge tops that are more exposed and don't have the soil development that you would find in lower spots. So we tested these topographic suitability maps that were made from those digital elevation models. And we performed a field test of this concept at 2 sites in Hawaii on the Big Island, and also at 2 sites in Southern California. One was Vandenberg Air Force Base, and the other was the Santa Monica Mountains. And we recorded a lot of data in the high and low suitability areas that were mapped at each one of those 4 sites. So we collected data on environmental conditions that are important for plant growth. So these are some Cal Poly students setting up a wind anemometer at Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is a very windy place. And then we also looked at plant performance at those sites. And in Hawaii, we had an opportunity to actually plant some endangered plant species using this experimental design where we had high suitability plots paired with low suitability plots. And we planted over 5,000 individual plants of a variety of species that are listed as either threatened or endangered on the endangered species list, with the hopes that we could learn how to use this type of analysis to promote the recovery of these species that are at risk of extinction. We've taken at least 3 classes of Cal Poly students to Hawaii who have worked in this project, either digging holes or weeding or actually planting the plants themselves. So it's been great to have so many students involved with this project, even though it's a little bit further away. I also just want to take a moment and thank Jay Smith, who co-teaches this class with me. He's been really supportive in making time in the class for having the students out there in the project, and it's really supported my research, as well as given the students a lot of really great opportunities to be in the field. So thanks, Jay. And we've been monitoring plants in this experiment since 2012, really, and looking at how they've grown over time and how they have survived and grown in high suitability versus low suitability plots. I'm not gonna have enough time to really show a lot of data today, so I'm just gonna give you the executive summary, which is that high suitability sites, those depressions that are protected from the wind, they all had environmental conditions that were more favorable for plant growth. Our measures of plant stress and physiology showed that plants were less stressed in high suitability sites. And we did find that some species seemed to benefit more than others. So some species really did much better in high suitability compared to low suitability, and others were not as different. And we found that there's the greatest difference between high and low suitability sites in the driest and windiest sites. And this was true both in Southern California, where Vandenberg was our drier, windier site, and also in Hawaii as well. So this modeling approach really has the most power in the driest and windiest conditions. So then another aspect of this framework is to combine different types of information to help plan management strategies. So now I'm going to show you how we combined our topographic suitability map with another map of fire fuels. So this is from the same site in Hawaii, where invasive fountain grass is a problematic invader that causes fire. And so we modeled fire fuels as non-living vegetation less than 1 meter, which was modeled from a combination of this spectral data as well as the LiDAR data for the height. So this really gives us a nice map of where there's a high accumulation of dead grasses. And then we combined the fire fuels map with our topographic habitat suitability map. And this gave us kind of 4 different scenarios to think about how to prioritize management activities. So for example, we are showing here in the gray color, these are sites that have low fire fuels and high suitability for restoration. So we recommend prioritizing endangered plant reintroduction in those sites because they're not likely to experience fire, and they have the best potential for growth and establishment of those planted individuals. The red areas show regions with high fire fuels and high suitability for growth. So we said that these would be good areas to target using restoration to reduce fire fuels. So that process involves removing the invasive species and then replanting a fast-growing native species that can get established and help exclude those invasive grasses from coming back in. Because if it's a high suitability site for plant growth, the invasive species are going to benefit from those resources as much as native species would. So getting native establishment in those regions would help reduce overall invasion. And then areas that are shown in black, so you can kind of see on the map here where those black areas cluster. These are places with high fire fuels but low suitability for plant growth. So we recommend using physical fire barriers like the typical bulldozer lines in those regions because they're very prone to fuel accumulation, but restoration is not likely to be as successful there. So have started implementing some of those management practices in this site. They have some new bulldozer lines and some new restoration sites to try to reduce the overall fire risk. So just to kind of summarize, really the goal of my whole research program is to try to improve the practice of restoration, either by understanding how ecological theory can help us refine our treatments, but also using this landscape approach to help prioritize management activities over very large inaccessible areas, which are going to be the types of problems that we have to deal with now and into the future. And really the goal is to improve the cost ratios for restoration because there is always very limited funding, and the overall result should be improved ecosystem recovery. So I want to take a few moments here just to thank some really important people. I want to thank all of the collaborators who have worked on these projects with me over the years. I really want to thank my funding sources, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, the Department of Defense CERDIP and ESTCP programs, the Cal State Agricultural Research Institute, which has also been very generous in funding my research. And I want to thank the department and the college at Cal Poly for the smaller research funding that we've received. I have had a great experience working with some amazing graduate students here, and they've all been a very significant part of all of the research that I showed you today. So I'm very grateful to them. And they have also driven a lot of this research with their own questioning and curiosity, which has been really exciting. I lost track counting how many undergrads we've had out in the field, but it's definitely more than 80. That's a conservative guess, that have helped out just either as volunteers or through course-based research or other types of experiences. They've really been a part of the data collection and the data analysis for some of these projects. We also have a new partnership with the STEM program from the Los Angeles Audubon. And so we had about 20 students per year come assist with our field work as well. These are high school and community college students. There's a lot of people involved in doing research at a university. So I just want to thank everyone who has helped me submit proposals, pay for things, figure out how to get the vehicle fixed, or, you know, there's so many things involved with research. And I'm very grateful to all of the staff who have really been crucial in solving a lot of problems. So thank you all so much, and especially support from my department chairs and the dean's office. It is really valuable to have the support of your institution doing this kind of work. I need to thank my family, who've also been a big part of supporting my research and keeping things going at home when I'm out in the field, letting me go to Hawaii without them. They've made a lot of sacrifices for me to do this work, and I'm very grateful to them as well. So thank you all for coming today, and I'm so honored to be giving this talk, and I'm excited to take your questions.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Erin, and everyone. Let's give Erin, Dr. Questad, a virtual applause, either with your emojis or your hands. We can, you can hear my applause at least. And we do have time, at least 10, 12 minutes, that we can take some questions. There is a chat box, and I'm seeing a few questions go in there. So I will just look at the chat box if you don't mind.
Sure.
And we'll start there. First, we have a question from Glenn Kagayama. What is the water source for your drip lines? Ever water, always about water.
For which drip lines?
I guess drip lines. So,
the drip line that you showed at the Hawaii site.
Oh, we actually hauled out giant water tanks.
I was wondering.
And put them up on a hill.
You didn't turn on a water spigot.
No, we would have to, it was someone's full-time job to keep them full.
I see.
So they had to go to the fire dip tank, siphon out the water, and then pump it into our tank so that it could gravity feed our drip lines.
Did you use rain barrels?
If we didn't have as many plants, we could use rain barrels. But the National Fish and Wildlife Service, or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, made us have a little individual dripper for each endangered plant. So we had 5,000 drippers.
Okay, I'll never complain about our backyard now.
Yes.
All right, we have a question from Jay about, is the genetic makeup of the plants taken into account, including thoughts about using phenotypes that are more adapted to water stress, climate change, or other stresses?
Yes, that's a really great question. In restoration in general, the philosophy is to use localized genotypes as much as possible. People are a little worried about moving genotypes, like taking drought tolerant genotypes from Baja and moving them north. It's definitely something people are talking about, but no one is actually doing a lot of that at the moment. With the Hawaii experiment, we did keep track of the genetic lines for all of our plants. And that's something that I haven't spent a lot of time looking at yet, but it's definitely something that I think if we start looking at, we might find some of those lines were better than others.
Wonderful. Well, here's another technical question from Craig Lamunya. He says, how do soil nutrients affect restoration/invasion? It seems that in a mature stand of chaparral, most of the nutrients are tied up in the plant biomass, but after a fire, that is liberated and moves into the soil. Is this correct? And could you use this to tip the scales toward natives?
Yeah, so there are usually a lot of nutrients released after a fire. It depends on the type of fire, but typically, yeah, there's nutrients available. Unfortunately, high nutrient availability really benefits the invasive grasses. So that is one of the reasons that they can invade following the fire. So it's possible that by tying up some of the nutrients, we might be able to reduce their invasion. And there have been some studies where they've used like sawdust or even sugar to try to tie up the bacteria, you know, that do the mineralization. But it's really difficult to do those kinds of treatments because they don't last very long. So you have to reapply over and over and over again. But yeah, it's challenging in our region too, because we have very high levels of atmospheric nitrogen deposition. So there's always fertilizer pouring out of the sky, and that makes it harder to control the invasive plants.
Spelling of something.
Uh-oh.
Oh,
Okay. There's an interesting comment there about raking the forest. I'm going to do the next one first to make sure we have time. How do you think government organizations should be using native restoration as part of hazard mitigation plans?
It's definitely should be part of it. It's tricky because the native species burn as well. You know, they are part of what burns out there. So it would depend on the type of hazard. But if the hazard is erosion or debris flows, which is a huge hazard, I do think that native restoration is one of the most important components of that type of mitigation, where it would actually, if done properly, could prevent some of that erosion.
Okay, now we have another. Glenn is asking lots of questions. So I'll first take this second one. Would ice plant be fire resistant?
Ice plant is a horrible invasive species. So even if it is, it would not be recommended. It really is mostly a coastal species. So we did have a lot of ice plant at our sites in Vandenberg, but it is notorious for outcompeting everything else in its path. So it would not be useful for restoration at all.
They couldn't be used as a fire break.
It might be able to be used as a fire break, but the root systems are not very, I don't think the root systems of ice plant would really provide the slope stabilization like other species would.
Okay.
All right. Then there's a question from Barty. She's asking, does after every fire, sometimes annual, do the native species experience a decline? And does each of these events have increased invasive species coming in since they grow fast? So, you know, essentially this spiral that you can't get out of.
I'm sorry. Could you rephrase it?
Marty, why don't you just ask it? Because when I tried to read it, it didn't quite work.
Hi, Erin. Great
Hi.
job and congratulations.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, like, you know, at some areas do experience these fires very often, maybe annually. And as you had mentioned that after every fire event, the invasive species seems to like come back sooner as compared to the native species. So have any studies quantified that does every fire leads to decline in native species and we are experiencing it regularly? And at the same time, these native species, these invasive species are taking over these areas more and more.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of study, not a whole lot of experimental work, but people who have looked at, you know, fire maps and compared the plant communities of sites that have burned annually versus every 5 years versus every 10, 20, et cetera. And they've really documented a consistent pattern that the more frequently a site burns, the higher level of invasion. So yeah.
Death spiral. Okay, we have Maximo put in a question here.
Oh, no.
Wants to know, would using CRISPR or base editor improve the survivability or performance of native plants? Can you answer that one?
Probably, maybe someday. So when you grow up and learn how to do those things, you can genetically engineer some native plants.
I'm very impressed.
Well, maybe like who asked the ice plant question?
Yeah.
Max, we need to let some other people ask questions now, okay?
All right, we have another question from Craig Lemunion. Can you treat a burned area with a herbicide that targets monocots to prevent the non-native grasses from becoming established?
Yes, there are grass-specific herbicides that are used, and they do have some non-target effects, so they're not, you know, super specific, but they do use them. They're not as effective as the herbicides that just kill everything. So it takes a lot more work to use those herbicides, but yes, that is one of the strategies that people use.
All right. Well, I think we only have 1 or 2 minutes, and I'm going to ask the last question. You kept saying cage your sage, but then I'm thinking that might work in the backyard, but out in the large acres, is there anything that is comparable to caging your sage, or are those little bunnies and everything going to eat up? They are the biotic filter, right?
So we're experimenting right now with using cages just initially during the first year or two of establishment. So if you are actually going out and planting individual seedlings, you can put a cage around it and then take it off in a couple of years. But for really large scale, it would require more either strategically planting plants near unpalatable species so that they might be protected by them. Or like a lot of times we use yucca and other like pokey species to put around the restoration area to keep people from coming in. So it would also keep animals from coming in too.
Right. Okay.
But yeah, it's a challenge. It's going to be a challenge. And in larger sites, deer are also an issue.
Yes.
So that's another whole other challenge.
Deer and bunnies.
Yeah.
All right. With that superb talk, I've learned so much. Let's again give our virtual applause to Dr. Erin Questad, who is being honored with our 2019-20 Ralph W. Ames Distinguished Research Award. And thank you again. Great full audience. Thanks so much, Erin.
Thank you.
Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.